Welcome back to the World Economic Forum here in Davos, Switzerland. You're watching Huffpost Live, and I'm now joined by Badr Jafar, the CEO of Crescent Enterprises. Badr, thanks for being with us. For those who aren't familiar with Crescent Enterprises, what is it?
So the Crescent Group, the family business group based out of Sharjah, which is one of the Emirates in the United Arab Emirates. It's a 42-year-old business. Has its roots actually in the oil and gas space and sector through Crescent Petroleum. But over the years and with the economic diversification of the UAE and the Emirate of Sharjah, we've diversified into a number of other industry verticals. And all those industry verticals are held under the Crescent Enterprises umbrella.
Right.
And that includes verticals such as ports and logistics, in healthcare, in aviation, and private equity. Very heavy infrastructure-related investments.
And obviously, the UAE, for those who are familiar with it, whether to a great extent or not, is a success story in its own right, especially in recent history. And there's so much to discuss as it pertains to here in Davos, outlining problems, forecasting problems. A couple years ago, I know you've been here for several years now, it seemed that the focus was more on the global financial crisis, rightfully so. Now that conversation seems to have shifted towards youth unemployment, which of course is staggering in the region. As you know, nearly 70% of the population is under the age of 29. With all this in mind, where do you think are the major challenges and opportunities? I know you also think corporate governance is a major issue as well.
I do. I mean, it was interesting to read the Global Risks Report published by the World Economic Forum, where they outlined the 10 top global risks. And I looked at that sort of from a mindset of a Middle Eastern businessman.
Yeah.
Of course, the fiscal crisis was at the top of the list. And of course, there are challenges in the Middle East and North Africa, in particular in the post-revolutionary countries such as Egypt and Libya and Tunisia, which still have major fiscal challenges. So that, of course, still is very relevant. The second one on the list, I believe, was youth unemployment, structural youth unemployment, and underemployment. Yeah. That's a major issue.
Of course. The world over, really.
The world over, but the rates of youth unemployment in the Middle East are far higher than any other region of the world. We need to create hundreds of millions of jobs over the next 20 years just to stop youth unemployment from rising. And the solutions at that scale are not yet there and not being implemented. There's a sort of short-term sort of mindset, and then there's a longer-term sort of solution and mindset. And the shorter term, I guess, the only way you can get there is through massive investment in infrastructure to create those jobs urgently. But in a longer term, we need to create an ecosystem for entrepreneurship and to be able to build up SMEs, which ultimately are the largest employers in any economy. Right now makes up less than 20%. The SME space, let's say, makes up less than 20% of the economy in the region. And we need to get that up to at least over 50% if we're going to have sustainable jobs. And it's not just, when I say jobs again, it's not just salaries and job titles. It's productive jobs,
right?
Because as a saying goes, an idle mind is a devil's workshop.
Right.
So the criticality of the critical aspect of this sort of challenge is one where we need to make sure that people are actively engaged and productively engaged in society. Otherwise, it's likely they'll fall to extremism.
And some of the conversations, obviously extremism, because you bring that up, is a threat in the region that's often focused on in the media. And I want to talk later about kind of media narratives about the region and how perhaps that can be shifted, even within the region, not just abroad.
Sure.
But I was just in Dubai and Kuwait. I have family in Kuwait, and there seems to be this conversation to focus on something positive for a second, that Dubai in particular is back. After several years of perhaps being absent, from the scene of commerce and business and tourism, if you will. Is Dubai back? Is the UAE back? And what does that connote really to you?
Back sort of gives a connotation that
it was gone.
Left for a while. I disagree that it was.
Okay.
I think, look, there's 22 countries in the Arab world today, and there are very few countries, really a handful, that you can today say have progressive economic as well as stable policies that are really encouraging that sort of progressive and inclusive growth. The UAE is by far sort of ahead of the game.
Yeah, a leading example.
Leading example.
No, certainly, most certainly.
And so, but of course, I guess in a more sort of positive global sentiment environment, the UAE will benefit from that. And indeed, certain things like the Expo 2020 win,
of course,
certainly boosted confidence, and there is a nice buzz which is going on in the UAE as a whole, not just Dubai. And each emirate has its part to play in that process.
I mean, I take your point that it was never gone. I do see where you're coming from, but you know, oftentimes perception dictates reality, and there is a perception that there's a kind of you know, like the region, or UAE is leading the region in this kind of re-emergence or resurgence, if you will. At least that's the perception. And I also want to mention, you said you are very optimistic for 2014 about the region's buoyancy in general. And I'm curious, you know, in light of all the things that the media often focuses on, sectarian divisions in the region, Syria, the refugee crisis, why are you optimistic?
Because one has to be optimistic.
That's a good answer.
Look, I mean, I'll tell you where I'm concerned, and it goes back to a challenge which the region is facing, which people aren't necessarily focusing on, and that's one related to corporate governance. And I'll tell you a little bit about why I think that that's a major problem. I mean, I'll be drastic and say that it's a time bomb on the verge of exploding in our region. So 90% of all the non-oil GDP in the Arab world is created through family businesses. But the vast majority of those businesses today, over 2/3, are in the second generation. In the next 10 years, we're going to have the vast majority of transition between second and third generation in our region. I think the IMF estimates that over $1 trillion is going to pass between second and third generation, or between one generation and the next, in the Arab world in the next 10 years. We don't have today the governance, the corporate governance structures to be able to protect that value. And as you know, the biggest value destruction in family businesses happens when you move from the siblings consortium to the cousins consortium. And on average, only 30% of companies actually survive that shift and transition. So we have a potential to lose, or to have a value destruction of about $700 billion in the region over the next 10 years. So what was critical is to think about how one can, and again, urgently address that issue, developing corporate governance frameworks, which was really the thing that led to the creation of something called the Pearl Initiative, which is a private sector initiative which we set up in partnership with the United Nations Office of Partnerships, and now in partnership also with the UN Global Compact, to look at where we can develop governance structures really to protect those values and to protect that value. And the way in which we're going about doing it is not through sort of regulation or rules. That's up to the government to set, and the governments across the region are developing sort of legal framework to try and protect that value. But it's really identifying the business case. So the value creation and adopting these structures, these governance structures, and it includes everything from transparency, accountability, of course, anti-corruption, the role of women in business, all those parameters and aspects. So that's something which the Pearl Initiative is working on. There are, of course, other organizations which are working on that. But that's where I see the biggest risk, I think, on a regional basis over the next decade or two, in addition to, of course, the youth unemployment crisis.
Of course, and I don't want to harp on it too much, but the youth unemployment crisis is something that's very palpable for the youth, obviously. I live in the West, I work in the West, but when I go back, I have many friends who are living in the Arab world, who are very talented. You know, there's a lot of talent. There's a great pool of talent, especially in the Gulf. And I'm just curious, you know, there are big companies in the UAE, well-known companies, you know, across the globe. You know, Emirates, Jumeirah, Mubaddala. You know, people know these companies, and yet I wonder if you think that there's still a lack of an ability to really reflect the talent in the region going forward beyond these companies. Do you think that's true?
Look, I'm glad you mentioned those three companies because Emirates Airlines, Mubaddala, as well as Jumeirah Group,
they're everywhere.
They're great brand ambassadors, and they're great at representing what the talent, the creativity that the region has to offer the world. But three examples from a region of 22 countries of 400 million people is not a great track record. So we have a huge opportunity, in my opinion, to use our businesses to act as our ambassadors, to use our products and our services to act as our ambassadors. The best way to develop affinities and to develop sort of communication through, with, or from the region to other parts of the world is through our products and our services, and also through our creative economy. So cultural diplomacy is one that I think is critical.
Well, I'm glad you brought up culture and cultural diplomacy. It seems that there's somewhat of a focus on that more and more throughout the Gulf and even throughout the region. You know, I was working before Huffpost Live in Qatar with the Doha Tribeca Film Festival.
Sure.
There's a partnership, of course, as you know, in the UAE, many film festivals.
Sure.
Increasingly, there's music and a focus on those kinds of things. And I saw that you had said that you also think it's important to focus on these kinds of things, like sectors like music and film. Why is that so important?
Music, I mean, so music is a language, is a universal language. Okay, it doesn't have a race, a religion, a color, a nationality. It has a phenomenal ability to cut across borders in a non-political, non-threatening way, and in a creative way, and entertaining way.
And tell stories.
And tell stories. So, but music is one of those aspects, and that's really why that led to the venture which I have with Quincy Jones called the Global Gumbo Group, which is actually supposed to, or what it's doing right now.
Right.
So we set up the Dubai Music Week, which is a really a sort of full-fledged festival, everything from seminars to conferences to workshops. But what we want to do is to create a platform for local talent to be able to launch globally. And that includes, of course, singers, but not just but writers and everything
that involves
everything
the
that
industry.
involves that industry in that space. So music is one aspect. Film is another. I mean, you don't have a more powerful medium than film to be able to tell those stories and tell them for what they are. We don't have, you know, a region like the Middle East and North Africa, or the Arab world, as it were, and as you will know, is so rich in history and culture. We're not using that content to be able to tell stories and to build bridges. So that's something which I think has tremendous potential. The theater space is something I think also that's phenomenal. Theater and the skills that theater brings youth, of course, beyond just the actual act of acting, through communication skills and confidence. That's something which is critical, which is why we set up the Middle East Theater Academy, which Kevin Spacey's involved in as well. And plan to roll out some workshops across the region, and theater academies across the region as well.
Yeah, it's great to see those collaborations. I remember Kevin Spacey, obviously very involved in the UAE, also had come to Qatar, and it's nice. It's nice to see the investment, exactly. And you know, the internet technology has certainly disrupted, you know, governments, but also politics and also aspirations. I mean, there's a lot of young people in the region. There's a hunger for kind of innovation and for an entrepreneurial spirit. It's a theme here, obviously, at Davos, to kind of try and address youth unemployment. A lot of people saying we need to start teaching entrepreneurship at an early level in terms of education, even a primary level.
Yes.
To your estimation, what does that look like? And you know, you were talking about something that I'm actually very passionate about as it pertains to the region, women and the role of women in innovation.
Absolutely.
How can we actually make that happen?
Look, the region, and it's not the only region of the world, but there's been an over-reliance on government to solve and deal with social as well as environmental challenges that exist in the region. And business has not stepped up properly to engage constructively in that process. So we have a huge opportunity to get businesses, existing businesses, to try and take a long, hard look at their business models and really see whether they're adding value beyond just shareholder profit. And that's one aspect. But there's a whole space when entrepreneurship, where new businesses can be created, specifically to deal with certain challenges, be it social or environmental. And this is where social entrepreneurship can, I think, play a very important role. And there's no better sort of group to embrace that than our fresh graduates.
Of course.
So that's, I think, starting, and again, before even they get to university.
Right.
And before the education system sometimes sets certain perceptions in their mind, we can instill that culture into them of being able to embrace business as a medium for positive social change and environmental change in the region. So we're working through organizations such as Ashoka, Synergos, Endeavor, to try and develop those programs and find young social innovators who can be a constructive part of that process.
Last question, because this is so interesting to me, something you touched on in a recent article. You said as an executive in the Arab world, you can relate, and I can relate to this, by the way, that's why I wanted to save this for last, if you will, that you're looking and struggling to find publications that accurately inform on locally and regionally relevant topics that might not otherwise be discussed in Western publications. For a lot of Arabs who live between the West and the East, at least in my experience, my friends, we do feel as though the story that's being told, even though there are some great stories, often in the media in the West is limited, is somewhat narrow. within the region, what do you mean by this statement? I mean, why do you think that is, and how are you hoping, more importantly, to fill the information gap?
You know, there's a lot of complaints in the region about how we're being portrayed as this, we're being portrayed as that. And you know what? It's only our fault.
Right.
If we have certain stories to tell, if we have certain perspectives, then we need to communicate those. And if we're not communicating those, we can't blame someone else for misinterpreting something.
There is too much of that.
So, you know, one way of doing that, and again, is involving students. So with the Pearl Initiative, for example, we've developed a case study competition where students from across the whole Gulf region now are going out into their communities and writing case studies on best practice.
Right.
So the idea is that in relationship-based societies, positive reinforcement works a lot better than naming and shaming. So we're going out there to try and find these stories, these positive stories, and they do exist, and being able to put them down in a format that's recognized globally, so in business school case study formats, using practitioners from other universities and globally to try and make sure that it's in a format that they will hopefully accept and include in their curriculum, and then pushing those out there. So I mean, it's not there, it's not enough, but it's only our fault, and we need to do something about it.
Nice to own up to it. I like it. You know, that's something, a message I think that's important for the region, and always inspiring. Thank you so much for dropping by, Badr. It's such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Al-Afu. And we're obviously going to have many more conversations here at the World Economic Forum. Be sure to keep watching.